Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our next webinar series featuring Dr. Carolyn Lemsky. So as a brief introduction, Carolyn is a clinical director at Community Head Injury Resource Services of Toronto and also director of the Substance Use and Brain Injury Bridging Project. Funding for this particular series is provided by the Administration for Community Living and co-sponsored by the ACL Underserved Populations and Opioid Use and Mental Health Needs Work Groups. We are so honored to have you speaking with us today, Carolyn. And my understanding is today we're going to be talking about TBI and substance use. So given that, I'm going to hand this over to you, and we are excited and ready to learn.
Thank you so much, Amanda. Thanks for the invitation to do this talk. It's a topic that's near and dear to my heart. I have really no disclosures to make. I'd like to acknowledge, though, the clients who have generously allowed me to sort of tell their stories today. I've redacted some of their information so that their identities are concealed, but they've been really important teachers in this whole journey, and as have the staff and the folks that I work with at both the Center for Addiction and Mental Health and at Community Head Injury Resource Services of Toronto. I also would like to thank one of the primary funders, the Ontario Neurotrauma Foundation, who helped us to develop some of the materials that I'm going to be talking about today. So this is the third in a series of webinars. These are the URLs, and I think that the PDF that you got with your registration should enable you to access these. I'm going to start out actually by thanking you all the registrants, for the amazing and hard-hitting questions that you sent with your registrations. In many cases, they got right to the core of the interaction between brain injury and problematic substance use and mental health. But they also highlighted the fact that we're entering into this really complex space from very different perspectives, and probably resources, programs with very different focuses and very different resources. And so we have very limited time together. I'll do my best to address the questions that have arisen. But we're going to start out with a very brief review of the first two, just so you'll know what you would find there if you haven't already seen those two webinars. And then we'll move on to a case-based explanation of how substance use and brain injury interventions can be integrated. So in that first webinar Dr. Corrigan gave, he provided a definition of acquired brain injury. And he reviewed how loss of consciousness or alteration of consciousness is one of the ways that we define severity of acquired brain injury. He talked about the people who are most at risk for acquired brain injury, and they would include athletes, military personnel, and people who have had previous brain injuries. So of course that brings to mind that many of the people that you're serving will have complex histories that include multiple acquired brain injuries. And he talked about the epidemiology of brain injury in mental health and addiction settings and gave us a lot of interesting facts. But one of the things that really was an important take-home message was that brain injury is 3 to 4 times more common in psychiatric and substance use settings than in the general population. And up to 75% of the people that you serve in programs that are designed to cater to people who have concurrent disorders, both mental health and addictions issues, for example, will have some form of neurocognitive impairment, most traumatic brain injury. And more than half of all the people who are hospitalized for traumatic brain injury have a history of substance misuse. So there's a lot of interaction there. He talked quite a bit, did Dr. Corrigan, about the clinical presentation of folks after brain injury, and really described how brain injury can be an invisible disability. And the first thing that you might notice that for these folks, there's an even greater difficulty or gap between what they say they're going to do and what they're able to actually act on. They often have, because of organizational and memory difficulties, greater difficulty in accessing care and remaining in care. And of course, they certainly have poorer access to the social determinants of health, and they may have more problems with housing and the criminal justice system. So it all comes down to what an acquired brain injury may look like in your practice if you're working in an addictions or in a mental health setting. And the first things that you might notice are missed appointments, irritability, socially inappropriate behavior, difficulty following through with plans. And these are the folks that you might be tempted to see as unmotivated or uncooperative. And one of the very important messages from that webinar was that you never know what's causing a problem. And so probably the best way forward is to help a person to compensate for what appears to be the difficulty, and that gives you a way to move forward productively with your clients. Now, some basic recommendations for care, and hopefully we'll have some good illustrations of how these can be carried out, include routine screening for brain injury and other sources of neurocognitive impairment if you're working in an addictions and mental health setting. And if we have ABI providers out there, I would say that screening for substance use is a very important first step. And then learning to recognize when behaviors are the result of neurological challenges. Making programs more accommodating. And we'll talk some more about that today. And very importantly, viewing complexity as a rule, not as an exception to the rule, and developing programming accordingly. And having care plans that include longer term supports. And hopefully we'll flesh that out a little bit today. Now, in my last webinar, we talked a little bit about how brain injury affects behavioral health. And we took quite a bit of time to talk about the disruption of functional connectivity between executive centers in the frontal lobes and in the temporal lobes, and how this alters the ability to regulate behavior and emotion. And there were a number of diagnostic considerations that we talked about. First of all, that brain injury might worsen pre-existing mental health problems, primarily because imbalances in some of those functional networks may exist on the basis of the mental health disorder. And we talked about the social impacts of disability leading to mental health problems. So if a person has a traumatic brain injury and they are failing at work, or they've become unemployed and they have fewer social contacts, those things would of course have a negative impact on mental health. And again, we don't know what's often causing a particular behavioral health problem, and we have to consider that providing the compensation strategies and the accommodations is probably the best way forward. So we talked a little bit about considerations for intervention, and these include accommodating cognitive impairments, and we talked about that in some detail the last time on where you can get more information about cognitive accommodations. And we talked about addressing the neurobehavioral difficulties, something I'm going to pick up on again today. We talked about the importance of monitoring for suicidality because of the very elevated risk in this client population, and how psychosocial treatments are effective, particularly when the injury is mild and the neurocognitive problems are subtle. And we talked about this particularly in the context of, say, PTSD when it occurs with an acquired brain injury. The same approaches are found to be effective whether or not there is a history of acquired brain injury, although with more severe injuries, some cognitive accommodations may be required. So here is a schematic of the cognitive supports in the counseling setting. And on the right-hand side, you see a little model for cognition. And we talked a little bit about how each of these cognitive elements build one on the other to allow a person to have good, effective cognitive functioning. And so you, for example, have to be alert. You have to be awake before you can pay attention. And you have to pay attention before you can really process information. And of course, you have to process it before you can remember it. And you have to have some recall of information in order to be able to use it in those executive processes that include planning and decision making. So along the left-hand side, you can see some of the basic cognitive support strategies that you might use when a problem is observed in any of those cognitive functions. And we won't talk about that in great detail again today, but you can go back and learn more about that in a fantastic program that we talked about last time, which is Accommodating the Symptoms of TBI, put out by the Ohio Valley Center for Brain Injury Prevention and Rehabilitation. And these modules will teach you about neurobehavioral impairments, the impact they have on folks' lives, accommodating the symptoms of TBI, as well as learning about the TBI identification method, or how to screen for the presence of brain injury. So one of the concepts that we talked about last time that I am going to dig into a little bit more today is this idea about awareness of neurological impairment. And the reason that I'm going to be talking about this is because it's really important to consider how aware an individual is of their neurological impairment as you're starting to craft or pull together an intervention that makes sense for those individuals. Now, there's a couple of really important concepts here. First of all, awareness is not a binary concept. Awareness develops over time and kind of in stages. And so you can go from a state of absolutely no awareness, where you don't see a problem, to intellectual awareness, where you might realize that other people are recognizing a problem in you, to emergent awareness, where you yourself recognize that a problem is happening, likely right after the problem has occurred. And then finally can get to a stage where you sort of own the fact that, yes, I have this issue, and I have an understanding of the implications of this issue, and I'm going to plan ahead so that this issue does not cause me problems. So I'm going to anticipate how I might have difficulties and address them. And you'll notice there's a little bit of color coding here. It's that good old stop sign color coding. And that relates to how much self-management you're going to expect from an individual based on their level of awareness of their neurological injury. So when a person has no awareness, it makes sense that they're unlikely to participate in cognitive compensation strategies to address it because they're not aware of it. And I often have people ask me the questions, how can I get people to be better at compensating for their cognitive impairments and be more organized? And the answer to that is, first, we have to build the awareness of the issue, and in the meantime, provide good feedback and the external environmental supports that help to get the job done. And hopefully we'll have some examples of that in our case studies. So the idea here is that in the beginning, we're going to pretty much focus on the environment providing the compensatory strategies. And then as a person begins to, through feedback and experience, gain a little bit more intellectual awareness, we might very cautiously pull in their participation for a compensation strategy. For example, support with taking notes during a session, and then providing a copy of those notes to them, and then reminding them or creating reminders with them about when they might refer to those notes. So you see there's a very high level of structure there, but it involves the client. When emergent awareness is occurring, you can start to have a client experiment with different kinds of solutions that they feel would be beneficial to them, writing a sticky note, writing a note, and then helping them to sort through what's been successful for them and what hasn't, and developing their own cognitive compensation strategy. But it's really when a person gets to anticipatory awareness that we're really expecting that there'll be consistent and effective cognitive compensation. So to make things just a wee little bit more complicated, awareness of neurological impairment is not unitary with respect to the type of neurological impairment that's occurring. There are some kinds of neurological impairments that are easier to recognize and have awareness of. So we know that sensory and physical impairments are easier to recognize and be aware of. And that probably makes, that's probably because when you have a sensory or a motor impairment, you're getting regular feedback from the environment about what isn't working. So you may know that you have a limp, or you may know that you have a problem seeing a part of visual space because you have a field cut. And then you may actually, because you recognize it, be compensating to some degree. But that same person who may have those problems may not be very well aware of problems that they're having expressing themselves or with memory. Now here again, those kinds of cognitive impairments, word finding and memory, are much easier to recognize because we get feedback from our environment regularly than insight into changes that might have occurred in social behavior, such as an egocentric style of communication. You know, I'm so busy thinking about what I'm thinking about that I can't factor in how you feel or what you might have heard. Or irritability, or other changes in behavior or personality that might have occurred as the result of a brain injury. And that's because we're often a little shy about giving regular direct feedback, and it can be easy to attribute problems to things other than our own behavior. And of course, and the most difficult yet, is developing awareness and insight into judgment. And we'll talk a little bit more specifically about how delayed discounting and poor recognition of consequences, which we'll talk about as somatic marking, are really difficult disabilities to have awareness and insight with. And that's in part what makes treatment of folks with both brain injury and substance use so complex to care for or work with, and what necessitates longer periods of treatment. Now, we can overlay all of these ideas about awareness of neurological disability onto the stages of change. And these are Prochaska's stages of change. And if you work in an addiction setting, this will be pretty familiar to you. Now, insight we talk about as a psychological phenomenon. And in the pre-contemplation stage, it can be either a person doesn't realize that they're having impairments, or in this case, they might be sort of pushing that away for psychological reasons, not wanting to have a problem or not being able to accept the nature of the problem. Now, again, through consistent feedback, a person may begin to contemplate making a change because they're achieving some degree of intellectual awareness, or they're becoming more willing to accept the need for a change. And again, preparation, they're recognizing the need for a change and maybe gathering their resources and getting ready to do something and actually actively making a change with respect to substance use. And then you get to a place where an individual has gone through the process of recognizing what's helpful. They can anticipate what they need, and then they're maintaining their progress. And so, and you can see the same color coding here. And again, we can talk about the color coding as being indicative of how much intensity or how much self-management we're expecting from clients or hoping to see based on their stages of change. And of course, we have clients who are in varying stages of change, and their stage of change may ebb and flow over time, along with the kinds of the level of awareness related to their neurological injury. So a basic concept is that how aware a person is will determine how much of the support is occurring on the basis of others in the environment or in structure in the environment. So less aware, more environmental structure, more aware, more readiness to change, more self-management is occurring, and more ownership of those environmental supports that are providing the path forward. Now, when we think about this, this is a really important concept. One of the things that we work towards in intervention is helping a person to become aware of those neurobehavioral difficulties that they're experiencing. And once they become aware of and accept the fact that perhaps on the basis of their brain injury, they're having more problem delaying gratification, or greater difficulty in planning ahead and withholding some behaviors or impulsivity, that they start to own the environmental supports, take greater advantage of the environmental supports. And at that point, environmental supports may actually be greater than they are in the beginning of treatment. So here you have a color-coded schema. And again, it's we're going to select where the person is in terms of their phase of treatment, and the 4 phases above we're going to loosely call engagement, persuasion, or preparation, for lack of a better term, and then active treatment, and then relapse prevention. And so when a person is unaware, we're pretty much in engagement. And as we'll talk about towards the end of this webinar, the interventions in this stage are really more geared to making sure that you're having regular contact with the individual, building their confidence to participate in the therapy setting at all, developing an understanding of what they need and their perspectives, and providing non-judgmental feedback so that by the time they get to developing some perhaps intellectual awareness of how their substance use might, or their cognitive impairment might be having an impact on their ability to achieve their desired goals, that you're able to work with them motivationally to start to try some actual active interventions, and ultimately to craft something that's effective for them, and then to work on maintaining it. So some examples of environmental supports would be supervision and structured activity. Now, very often we have clients whose lives are very disordered and they're constantly getting in trouble with the law. And as it turns out, that support and legal supervision might be the one way to help a person to get to the treatment. So that's a form of environmental support, unfortunate. Or a trustee, to have somebody else taking care of an individual's money in order that they have less access for substance, and that might stabilize the situation. Structured activity. Very often when we're trying to engage with somebody, we're trying to help them to participate in things that they find meaningful, but offer structure and supervision so that they directly compete with the substance use behavior. And hopefully we'll get some examples of that. When we're talking about collaborative interventions, we're talking about client-centered collaborative goal setting, so that the client is developing the plan of action, they're implementing what they feel is the best plan of action, and then the therapists and the providers together with the client are evaluating the outcomes of those interventions, and then modifying them as they are required. So these collaborative interventions are iterative over time, and they help a client to gradually move towards the kinds of supports and interventions that are most helpful to them. So that's kind of a big overview of how do we approach this from a wide angle lens. Now, when you think about most of the actual therapy types of interventions, most of them are geared towards harnessing that frontal lobe action that you've got going on to manage an emotional system or cognitive processes that may be causing some kind of a problem. So a person's an anxious thinker, and you're going to try and get them to use their conscious thought process to recognize that anxious thought process and to modify it in some way, or to use a mindfulness strategy to let go of the troublesome or difficult thought processes and come back into the moment. Now, one of the things that both I talked about and Dr. Corrigan talked about is this whole notion of the fingerprint of TBI. And one of the real take-homes here is that the typical pattern of TBI, because of the way the skull is shaped and because of the kinds of action that occurs in traumatic brain injury, is that the frontal lobes and the temporal lobes are really vulnerable, and all of the structures that connect that conscious thought process that occurs in the frontal lobes and all of the good social modulation kinds of cognitive activity requires a good frontal lobe and good connections to the temporal lobe, or all of those emotional machinery is is located. And so on the right-hand side of your slide, what you're going to see there is a graphic that's probably really familiar if you work in addictions. It's that dopaminergic network. And what you'll notice is that brain injury perfectly overlays all of those reward system structures. Now, very frequently an outcome of that is a brain that's tipped in the direction of wanting or looking out after short-term rewards. But that's something that we'll get to in just a moment. So this was a graphic that I showed you last time, and I'm bringing it back out now to kind of bring home the point that it's very important to engage clients motivationally so that we're eliciting from them what they most want, because they'll process that information if it's been elicited from them much more deeply. And they will develop a motivational structure that's consistent with good intervention. But what happens if they don't have enough executive control to take that good learning outside of the session? So that you really need that executive control to allow that to happen. And that's really where a lot of our clients with brain injury are at the biggest disadvantage. And so we'll be talking about modifying our approach to accommodate this. Now, there are a number of promising interventions when addictions co-occur with brain injury, and these include treatment incentives, community reinforcement approach, and motivational interviewing. And we'll talk about how some of these key neurobehavioral impairments that I've already alluded to, and they include delayed discounting and poor somatic marking, explain them in a minute, and we'll use case studies to illustrate how you can pull together a program of care that's going to be productive for your clients. And hopefully at the end of that, we'll have some time to get back to some of the questions that may not have been answered throughout the rest of the webinar. So if you're familiar with the addictions literature, and I hope you are, a lot of these interventions may look familiar to you. If you haven't a good familiarity with them, I really suggest getting more information and training, and I'll provide some resources for that. But what we know from the evidence base related to the general population is that treatment incentives, community reinforcement training, and motivational interviewing, as well as harm reduction, are all effective in improving outcomes for people who are living with concurrent disorders and complex care situations. We also know that cognitive behavior therapies, including relapse prevention, peer support programs, and pharmacological treatments are also effective. Now, I'll allude to some of the bottom three kinds of interventions, but we're really going to focus on the top four because they're the ones that really should have the most promise for our clients who have these complex histories. Now, in the same period of time when there have been thousands of articles in the general population looking at good approaches for the treatment of substance use, there have been fewer than 20 studies specifically for ABI treatment models. Now, my reading of the addictions literature is that they didn't actually systematically eliminate people with a history of acquired brain injury. So that's pretty interesting because that means that most of those interventions were actually validated with a significant portion of their folks having had a history of acquired brain injury that was perhaps unknown to the researchers. And so what that suggests to me is that perhaps this is why some of these programs of care really do have some promise, but we don't really know whether having a history of brain injury puts you at some disadvantage for actually getting to those treatments and staying in those treatments. And so that's what we're trying to address when we look at the ABI-specific treatment models. And I'll talk about how intensive case management, motivational interviewing, screening, and some of the learning from a program of screening and brief intervention, and strategies for treatment retention, which includes incentives, can be really productive for people with acquired brain injury. So when we look broadly, though, at all of the literature together, ABI-specific and concurrent disorder treatment models, there are some common characteristics, even though some of them have not actually been tested empirically. The models converge on the need for phased intervention that begins before insight and readiness to change. So that means that there's supports to engage in treatment and the development of behaviors that are incompatible with substance use. So helping a person to attend even a treatment program is certainly time away from the substance. But even more specifically, with some of the interventions like community reinforcement approach, there's an active role of getting a person more engaged in their life in order that they have less inclination and less opportunity to be engaging in the substance use behavior. And all of them have an emphasis on environmental supports. But the question I always get is, so what is an environmental support and what does that look like? And hopefully we'll address that in the case studies. So with the ABI-specific interventions, when we think about motivational interviewing, we know if you look very carefully at the Cox study, and I have the references for these in the handout, so you'll be able to look it up if you have an interest. We know that motivational interviewing improves motivational structure if you have a brain injury. We know that you're more inclined to say, yeah, I need some help, and maybe even try to participate, but it tends not to have as much impact on following through afterwards, and that's true for brief and longer term interventions. So what we can be doing is using motivational interviewing to accept appropriate environmental supports. And one of the case studies, I'll have an example of that. Now, what we've learned from screening and brief intervention and referral programs is that clients don't, people who have a brain injury don't benefit as well as the general population. And if you're not familiar with these interventions, the SBIRT intervention, screening and brief intervention and referral, are a referral and treatment, I guess, are it's a set of interventions that are designed to be implemented in emergency rooms, acknowledging that most of the people who go into emergency room were intoxicated at the time of injury. And so it became standard of practice to screen for substance use disorders, provide a brief motivational intervention, and then encourage folks to get appropriate follow-up or to alter their behavior depending on the severity of the issue. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that when properly done, this has a really big impact on whether a person's going to reduce their substance use or actually seek treatment. But that same intervention doesn't work very well for people with acquired brain injury. So Jennifer Bogner, and again, I don't have a reference for this because it's still in press, but by personal communication, we know that it's effective to provide this same intervention if you accommodate cognitive impairment by not just having a single session, but a booster session, and actively using cognitive accommodations to help a person remember what's occurred and to plan for their implementation of any decisions that they've made. A very important aspect of this brief intervention is the brain health focus. So when we're talking with someone about their substance use history, and in the context of having had a brain injury, we're specifically highlighting the fact that using many substances is often incompatible with good brain health. And Dr. Corrigan talked about the prevention messages that are specific to people with brain injury, and they include limiting recovery, the direct effects on substances, on balance, and of course, after brain injury, people's balance might be affected. So often it's, oh, well, I wouldn't want to make my balance worse by using a substance. Effects on behavior, impulsivity, interactions with other medications, worsening other cognitive problems like problems with memory and attention, having a negative impact on mood, and an increased risk for seizures. And some of the patient education materials that are available through the Ohio Valley website review these in a motivational fashion and help a client to consider whether or not they would want to change their substance use on the basis of improving their brain health. Now, another very important contribution to the brain injury literature was this idea about strategies for treatment retention, because we know that in the general population, if you get to treatment and stay there, you're much more likely to benefit. So it's highly correlated. The attendance early in treatment is highly correlated with outcome. So we also know that people with a history of brain injury or neurological impairment have more difficulty getting and staying in treatment. So how can we address that? So Dr. Corrigan and Jennifer Bogner and their colleagues did a randomized control trial with 4 conditions. One was and these were all implemented as one phone call. A brief motivational interview, reduction to barriers to attendance. So this could be talking to a person about what might make it difficult and helping them to get transportation, to plan ahead. A final one was treatment incentives. And the financial incentive was offered as kind of a nod to the behaviorist in the group who said, well, we really should be trying to do some behavioral intervention with reinforcement, because we know our clients are more responsive to immediate rewards. And so they offered to find a $24 gift certificate or $25 gift certificate if a person completed their treatment plan within a 1-month period. Now, the results of that study were a little bit surprising. Motivational interviewing didn't do much better than the attention control, and only 45% of those folks completed their individual service plan within 30 days. But check out what happened with the attention control or with the barrier reduction and financial incentive. 74 and 83% completed their service plan. Now, what's really more compelling here is that after 6 months, these are the individuals who were better retained in treatment and actually completed the program. So by 6 months, over 30% had terminated therapy in the group overall, but there was a 50% improvement over control for barrier reduction and financial incentives. So this brief phone call really made a big impact. When we were thinking about now, why did these interventions work? It was that attendance early in treatment that increased their engagement. But it's also this idea that rule-governed behavior was easier for many individuals surviving brain injury, and it enabled the engagement. So a person didn't have to consider in the abstract how they might benefit from therapy. They knew that they were working towards something that they could relate to as a reinforcement. Now, when Dr. Corrigan was talking to me about this way back when, he said, you know, when we interviewed folks, they didn't say it was because of the actual getting of the gift certificate. That really wasn't the big deal. They liked their therapist. They felt that the program was going to be helpful to them. But the feeling is that rule-governed learning made it easier for them to engage. They did engage, and then they had the benefit from the program. And then the support to attend the initial sessions had that same impact of helping with engagement. Now, that harks to what we were talking about before, about this known feature of people after acquired brain injury is that they often have difficulty with, and the term for it is delay discounting, or the devaluation of a reward because it's delayed. Now, the flip side of this is having difficulty in resisting a reward that is immediate. And of course, we know that the use of substances offers an immediate reward, and it can be very difficult for our clients to think ahead. Now, this same delay discounting tendency, although to a lesser degree, has been found in individuals who are substance users. And if you're interested in how this develops over the lifetime and how early brain injury or early traumatic events may play into this, you could look up online the marshmallow experiments, but we know that even from a very early age, this ability to resist the temptation to take an immediate small reward rather than a longer long-term reward, that ability to delay gratification is very important in being a productive human. Very important. So how are incentives used in programming? Well, treatment incentives are very common in opioid programs because delayed discounting is also very common in opioid programming. So you'll have lotteries earned for clean urines, for example. AA seems to have evolved in relationship to this because they provide tokens for achievement, AA chips. In our programs, we use tokens for attendance. So they got certificates of completion, and they used we used gift certificates for that early attendance. But every time that a client attended, they had a token so that they could remember and be aware of how their progress in therapy was going. And then other things that are more subtle can include like the availability of coffee at a treatment center, tokens, or meals when a person attends. So barrier reduction, how does that play out? Well, appointment reminders, support to plan for attendance. So this is some of that intensive case management that might occur. Talking with a person about transportation items, options, maybe even teaching them how to get to the program. Flexible appointment durations to accommodate a person's ability to pay attention or to stay alert. And then building routines that ensure regular contact with providers. So having the same appointment schedule, or having an appointment that's scheduled so that it links up with some other event that's occurring. You'll see me on the Monday, and then right after me, you'll see the doctor for your checkup. So all of those things play in to helping a person reduce the barriers to getting into treatment. Now, the treatment program that I'm going to sort of introduce through a case study is called Community Reinforcement Approach. And I've given you a link here to learn more about it if you don't know much about it. There's a lot of very strong evidence base for it. The central idea here is building a life that's more reinforcing than using substances. And so the program itself has a number of strategies that are integrated into it that we've already discussed. Functional, motivational strategies. It also includes this idea about functional analysis of substance use behavior. So if you work in a brain injury setting, it'll be a very familiar idea to you that you do a functional analysis of any problematic behavior so that you can use environmental supports and prevention strategies along with reinforcement and training opportunities to alter the course of an unwanted behavior. And that very same strategy is used in community reinforcement approach. The approach also includes things like sobriety sampling, and there's a recognition that a lot of the very problematic behaviors that are occurring when a person's using substances are going to continue to occur for a period of time while an individual is becoming involved in treatment. So there's some harm reduction with respect to those, and that includes communication training to help reduce conflict around the substance use behavior, domestic violence precautions, and then the heart of it is to teach people to reinforce non-using behavior, so getting somebody involved in something that competes directly with the substance use, and then significant other training to reinforce non-using behaviors in the home, but also to discourage using behaviors, not by nagging or punishing those behaviors, but by replacing it with sort of socially ignoring it, or making sure an individual is safe, but making sure that we're not engaging in behaviors with that individual that make the substance use worse, or the using or the conflict that occurs worse. So there's a couple of books I have up here. They're available on Amazon. One is How to Get Your Loved One Sober. It's something that we often give family members to talk about this, to introduce the CRA approach and to help them work through the behavioral analysis and to do some of the training with them on communication. And then for providers, motivating substance abusers to enter treatment, which is a more complete introduction to working with family members in the CRA approach. And there's a number of protocols that are available in the public domain. And here's one that I have the link here from the US Department of Health and Human Services. So let's talk about Andrea. This is Andrea. This is an example of the implementation of CRA. So Andrea's a 31-year-old dental hygienist. She's a mother of 4, injured in a single car accident about a year and a half prior to when she was referred. She was intoxicated at the time of injury. She had a severe TBI with 2 weeks of coma, so she was completely out, and 3 months of altered consciousness. So PTA refers to that period when she couldn't make memories and was still pretty disoriented. So right-sided frontal lobe hemorrhage with evidence of axonal shearing. So she's got that fingerprint of TBI that we talk about, where her executive functioning was pretty disconnected from her emotional functioning. Now, she also had a significant pre-injury history of alcohol use from the age of 14 up until the time she was pregnant. She was able to abstain during her pregnancy, but prior to her pregnancy had binges with blackouts and risky behavior. But nonetheless, she was able to hold a job, and she still maintained pretty good family relationships. Now, her mental health history, as we discovered it well into her treatment, included undiagnosed and untreated binging and purging, and some history of self-injury. So she was able to moderate her drinking for a few years, up until about 6 months prior to her injury, when she began to engage in some risky behavior, including driving while intoxicated. So when we assessed her, she had moderate memory impairment. And picture a person who can remember that you spoke with them, but they might have a lot of trouble remembering the details of what the conversation was. Her family described her as impulsive and irritable with episodes of aggression, exacerbated by her substance use. She had poor judgment, poor planning, limited awareness of her neurobehavioral impairments. She was aware that she was having some trouble with memory, but she wasn't convinced that it was as bad as folks were saying, and that she really needed to do anything consistent about it. So she had abstained 1 year post-injury as recommended by her doctors. And again, this is a familiar pattern that Dr. Corrigan talked about. So right after the injury, she was doing pretty well, but then she gradually increased her alcohol use up until the 6 months prior to referral. And that was related to some of the losses that she has sustained as the result of her neurocognitive impairments. And she was pretty pre-contemplative with respect to her substance use. She didn't believe that it was as bad as her family was saying. At the time of her assessment, she was living with her mother and daughter. She had a boyfriend who was a light drinker, lived nearby, supportive. She was pretty social with the rehab team, but really resented their presence because she didn't really understand why they thought her judgment was poor. And so they tried to do some experiments with her to help her to better appreciate time alone and what might be happening. But what that resulted in was that she was drinking to intoxication. And then when folks would come home, she was demanding, and verbal arguments ensued, and it was a pretty messy situation. She tended to minimize her use, sometimes saying that she needed to cut back, but she was definitely not ready to stop. Now, from her perspective, her life was not her own. And she thought that, well, I don't drink as much as people say, and not much makes her happy anymore. And she didn't see the point of her therapies. So now, and we won't get too much chance to talk about this, we know that there was substance use during development and that she had some vulnerabilities before her injury. And we also know that she had a lot of TBI behavior changes. Now, in our program, we often refer to neuropsychiatry, and this speaks to the need for partnerships. We're lucky to have neuropsychiatrists who actually consult with addiction medicine specialists. So we were able to address her TBI-related behavior changes whilst we were looking at her addiction medicine needs. And the other thing that was actually helpful with the TBI-related behavior changes was DBT skills, and we'll talk to the extent that I can about that. Her family environment included some heavy drinkers who did not want to take alcohol out of the situation. And we had to work with them, and CRAFT was the program that we used. And then, of course, because part of what was fueling her substance use was her mood, we had to work with her to accept her TBI-related disability. And psychotherapy, supportive psychotherapy was very important in that. Teaching her functional skills so that she could engage in the activities that she really wanted to do, like cooking meals for the family and getting out and doing some volunteering. ultimately, later in her treatment, she began to have more awareness of her disability, and she was more amenable to joining a peer support group. And we used positive psychology principles like the strength survey and some other pleasant events to increase the quality or improve the quality of her life. So in thinking about the CRA intervention, we looked at the behavioral analysis, okay? And this is an oversimplification, but it gives you a sense for what we were looking at. So we knew initially, now this is in the first phases of treatment, that when she was home alone, she drank to intoxication, and that led to falls and arguments. She spends weekends with her boyfriend and daughter at her boyfriend's home, and he doesn't have alcohol there because he knows it's a problem, and she enjoys the time. She's bonding with her daughter, and there isn't an issue. And so now we had a kind of a road in to take a look at what kinds of activities do actually successfully compete with the substance use. Even on date nights with her boyfriend, she was able to drink 1 glass of wine and have an enjoyable evening. Now, when she was at home and she had her bank card, there was some buying of alcohol and some impulsive spending, and she would hide that outcome, and arguments were occurring as a result of that. And she also had limited finances, and that created a problem. So the family intervention included education about the brain injury, why she was having difficulty following through with the things she said she wanted to do, and closely adhering to the CRAFT protocol, communication strategies to reduce conflict, particularly around the substance use, a safety plan when she was using substances. We encouraged them to take care of themselves while change was occurring, and how to take a collaborative approach to environmental supports rather than forcing her into certain situations, helping her to set goals and make attempts to include her plan in the planning of the treatment team. And then we also went through strategies to encourage non-use and discourage use. And this is a hard thing for families to learn. So on times when she was intoxicated, guiding her up to her room, asking her to sleep it off, indicating what they would be wanting to do with her once she's no longer intoxicated. And of course, she was irritable while intoxicated, so that was never very easy. But then actually helping her to see that there were a lot of opportunities for her to have healthy and happy engagement with her family when she wasn't using. Now, some harm reduction or environmental supports that were included, and this sort of illustrates how we worked with helping her to participate in the treatment planning, was that her goal was to parent her child effectively. And she knew she had a short fuse, and she knew that alcohol shortened her fuse. Now, the impact of her TBI became apparent with compassionate and non-judgmental feedback, and so did the feedback about alcohol use. And over time, she was able to acknowledge that probably on days when she's parenting, she shouldn't be drinking. We talked about brain health and her desire to have better recovery from her brain injury. And on that basis, she was interested in setting goals for limiting her substance use. But of course, it took a long time for us to make that a real possibility, and to take more control of her finances. And for that, we encouraged her to use environmental supports to recognize her impulsive spending and to make plans for spending, and then get access to her her cards. Now, just to give you a sense for what the timeline of this whole integrated set of treatments is, it took us about 8 months of getting to know her, developing confidence in the intervention and confidence in the fact that we were going to be judgmental before she actually allowed us to talk through in a very specific way what might be happening as a result of her neurobehavioral and her substance use problems. So that's a pretty long timeline. And I know that a lot of treatment programs will be looking like that. That's nothing like our 12 weeks that we have in an inpatient program. Well, the idea here is that when we're working with these complex folks, we need to be thinking more in a harm reduction mode. And programs like a needle exchange or safe use spaces will allow for engagement with the worker, and even while an individual is using, so that they can begin to develop their motivation for change. And when they're ready really to participate in the change, that's the time to pull out the big guns and start to think about that 12 or 16 or even year-long program that's going to be supportive, that's going to be directly addressing the substance use disorder. Now, this is her real timeline. We are still intervening with this individual, and she is now limiting her alcohol use with the support of her boyfriend and her family. And she's now just starting to actively consider sampling sobriety, and because she's getting frustrated that she wants the alcohol all day long. She wants to learn how to stop thinking about it all day long, and enjoy things that she's now become aware of that she can enjoy, like parenting her daughter and participating in some of the peer support that she's been working with. So the essential interventions included harm reduction, in this case, safer drinking with supervision, DBT skills, understanding and managing her strong affect and learning how to not use as a first response to feeling upset or depressed. Environmental supports, in this case, they included supervision with her alcohol, keeping the credit cards out of reach, scheduling, helping her to set goals and envision a future that was bright, so returning to preferred activities, discovering her strengths, and then using that brain injury lens, encouraging her to address her substance use as a matter of her own health. And we can't discount the positive impact of the neuropsychiatric intervention. She ultimately received medication, a stimulant medication to help her with focus because that was her main concern, and then antidepressant medication, which did help her with her mood and her emotional regulation. So program considerations. When you're thinking about programming for folks with substance use and brain injury, you have to be thinking about a longer length of stay, smaller caseloads, and the availability of case management or other environmental supports. And you may need a very assertive approach to getting a person engaged. Now, community teams that include the required expertise are really important. And you might think, well, that's a very privileged program that Dr. Lemsky is working in. We're a community-based program. We're funded to provide 4 hours a week of intervention for our clients as far as intensive case management. So what we've done is reached out to partners and developed close partnerships and preferred referrals so that we have a group of people who are working essentially as a team in these interventions. So in terms of program development, what we really need to do is to figure out how in your community you can get both sets of expertise at the table. If you are an addictions and mental health program, what I would suggest is reaching out to your local brain injury association and getting to know local brain injury providers so that you can become more aware of the resources in the community that would be helpful to your clients. Let's say if you're a brain injury program, reaching out to brain addictions providers, particularly those who work in the community with complex folks like harm reduction programs, will be very beneficial in terms of staff training and helping clients to get the support that they need. So I talked in the beginning a little bit about the second kind of neurocognitive impairment. And this we'll talk about as somatic marking. Now, the areas of the brain affected include that supraorbital cortex and the aspects of the temporal lobes where emotional machinery are. And what actually is happening here is that that middle part of the frontal lobe there on the underside is responsible for creating a feeling what it feels like to be in a given situation. So it combines all of the sensory memories that you have, and it gives you this somatic marker so that you can make a judgment. Is this good for me? Is this something I should do or shouldn't do? And it's often that somatic marker that dictates your behavior the next time you're in that situation. So for example, if you almost hurt yourself, by stepping off a curb in a certain way and a car zooming by, you might start to feel a little bit of anxiety when you approach that same place. Remember, oh yeah, this is a dangerous situation, and then modify your behavior accordingly. Now, and this, of course, is a more in-depth schematic of how different areas of the brain work together. The essential message here is that you learn about a certain situation and what it feels like or what it means, and then you use that sensory memory to decide what to do the next time. Now, what happens when a person loses that capacity for somatic marking, or the somatic marking is incomplete and fades, as so often happens after brain injury? So we have folks then who will have a tendency to not use caution. And these are the type of impulsive people who keep making the same mistake over and over and over again. And these can be very frustrating to work with, and certainly something that came up in the questions for this interview, or for this webinar. So let's consider very briefly Joe. And when what I've done is, in the handout that you got for this webinar, because we're not going to get time to talk about this in real detail, you'll have a full transcript of a portion of a session that I did with her, along with all of this history. But for this purpose, just for the sake of time, I'm going to go through it very quickly. So she was fell ill with meningitis, which resulted in confusion and a complete paraplegia at the T10 level, which she was rehabilitated for. Now, when folks go into spinal cord rehabilitation, very often there's recognition of the brain injury, and she got testing for it, and they identified a memory impairment, but that wasn't the focus of her rehabilitation. And prior to that, she had 2 concussions with a brief loss of consciousness. So, and those happened in her adolescent years. And now we know from information reviewed in previous webinars that that history of concussion increases emotional ability. It also increases the risk for substance use. And in fact, she was a fairly heavy substance user throughout most of her adolescence. Despite that, she was an honors student, graduated high school. She worked in food service jobs and was living with 2 roommates at the time she fell ill. She had that social history of binge type drinking that was fairly heavy, and she said that her friends would describe her as a fairly heavy drinker. Now, it's important to know that her father identifies as an alcoholic, and he's been sober 20 plus years, and he just simply stopped. One day he realized it was interfering with his family life, and without treatment, he stopped. So at assessment, she was referred by her disability support services at her university. So she gets rehab, she goes back to school, and she's having all sorts of problems. The problems that she's having in school kind of multiply. She's having difficulty with ambulating in her lower extremities. She has a neurogenic bladder, which means that her bladder fills and is less elastic, so she's has episodes of incontinence periodically. And so about 2.5 years after her injury, she starts to return to this old, very heavy pattern of drinking. And now it has the flavor of self-medicating because she's very distressed by the outcomes of her brain injury. So her substance use at the time of her assessment was 6 to 8 standard drinks in the evenings. And she was having loads of harms: blackouts, falls, lost employment, school failures. And she was contemplative. She was aware of the harms, and she'd been nagged by her dad to be attending AA, but he kept saying, I don't know why this is so hard for you. I was able to do it. You can do it too. And she was pretty ambivalent about making lifestyle changes, but she was also feeling pretty sad and pretty upset with herself. She had grief related to her impairments, needed extra time on testing, but didn't get any other appointments. And she wasn't really dealing entirely with all of her physical outcomes from her injury. And her mood was definitely depressed and anxious. So here's a little causal model for her. And there were physiological things like her genetics, but she also had this prefrontal injury that affected the connection between her frontal lobes and her emotional centers. She was self-medicating shame, loss, and anger. And she had a social environment because she was living with students, even though she wasn't she was only partially participating in school, that was dominated by drinking. She had very few friends and very few sober pursuits because the athletic things that she liked to do were no longer within her grasp. And cognitively, in addition to her memory impairment, we were aware that she was having problems planning, and we noticed that there was definitely an enhancement in her impulsivity, and she definitely had limited impact of delayed consequences. So we had to look at bridging that gap between say and do. And in this case, the therapist's role is to maintain optimism, to encourage systematic goal setting and skill building, and providing feedback, and helping a person to get a clear picture of the desired future, to learn to set a reasonable goals, and affirming strengths. Now, very often you'll get to folks who after repeated failures, and remember that to be successful in making the change, you really have to feel ready, able, and willing to do that. So affirming an individual's strengths despite these repeated failures because they're not able to follow through. And then you have to really build awareness about that neurological impairment. So you're going to help them implement plans and experience the barriers, but you're going to be providing support and feedback with that. And then ultimately providing that feedback, helping them to choose the supports that are going to be appropriate given their physiological difficulties. So we won't go into, I won't talk about this in detail, but we did a behavior analysis, and we did it with her because she was willing to do it, to look at what were the situations when she was most likely to use. And she began to realize that when she was with her family, she was not using alcohol, but under other conditions, she was using alcohol in a harmful way. And she was also realizing that even though she might intend to moderate, she wasn't able to moderate. And even though she might attempt to abstain if she was within the presence of alcohol, she wasn't able to abstain. So in this case study, what I'm going to pull out to emphasize is what happens with motivational interviewing and how you shift the focus in motivational interviewing to accepting the environmental supports that are required for success. So we'll just really quickly read through. This is a snippet of a session that I had with her about 18 months ago. I think you and I have talked about the impact of the meningitis when you had it. Right. And sometimes how it has affected you and how you make decisions about things in the moment. What have you noticed about that? So we're eliciting from her. And she says, I don't think I think very long about things. I mean, like I always think via hindsight, really. Oh, I should have done that type of thing. Or wow, what a huge mistake. Or I feel like I always know better, but then the same things keep happening. So you understand in hindsight that there should have been a better choice. But in that moment, something happens where, she says, I validate it for some reason. Now we're going to skip ahead in that conversation. And you have the full transcripts in your handout. And so after we finished eliciting, I kind of give this summary. So one of the reasons that people don't repeat the same mistakes over and over again is that it happens a couple of times and you build a memory of, wow, that didn't work out so well. And that memory comes with a somatic marker. It comes with a feeling of dread or, uh-oh, problems are coming, like anxiety. And that's what really stops you. That's what stops you from doing that thing you really shouldn't do. You know what? I am in dangerous situations more times than not, and I don't care. You don't feel it. Nope. Do you think that is a change for you? I only noticed that I shouldn't have been doing that. If I think, what if this person knew I was there, but then at the time, I just don't give a shit. In hindsight, but I don't think I used to be like that. So that's a thing? It's a thing. So here we're introducing to her, this is your neurological impairment. Now, mind you, I had to have a number of conversations with this young woman over time. But the good news was that she was willing to accept the need for more environmental supports. So it was in this session that we started to use her metaphor of puppy proofing. So she said, like, if I was a puppy, I would try to eat that steak off the table and you'd be like, don't eat that steak, stop eating that steak. That's right. And you wouldn't rely on the puppy's self-management. You'd prevent the puppy from eating the steak. Right. Because the puppy is like, why would I not do that? And so she's relating to herself that she's like a puppy. So this analogy really helps because I can't rely on myself to be accountable to myself. I have to make it as difficult for a while, right? And then, now mind you, I want to reframe this a bit because I want it to have a positive association. So we talk about, okay, I'm going to reframe that, all right? One way that you take responsibility for this is by making it easier on yourself. So you take responsibility by using the environmental supports that are going to make it easier on you. And then we talked a little bit about using visual reminders. And this is one example of a visual reminder that we created as a result of one of her sessions. This is a phrase, I guess, that's used a lot in AA that she's become enamored of, that you can't turn a pickle back into a cucumber, about the permanence of her alcohol use. And so she wrote a poem and made made this phrase. Now, the important thing here is that we want positive affect or optimism to be associated with the cue to remember the conversation. That's very important because she doesn't have a lot of capacity at this point to manage negative emotions. And if every time she sees something, it feels like a slam to her self-esteem, we're actually kind of fueling the emotional issue. So the idea here is that the associations with all the cognitive compensations are positive and optimistic. Even in the summary note, and you can read this from the handout, even in the summary note that I wrote after the session, and this is one of the things, she wasn't fully compensating yet for her memory impairment, although she realized that she wasn't remembering everything from session. So I wanted her to be able to have a review of the session after the session. So I would write a note to her, an email after the session. It was usually a cut and paste from a clinical note. And then I included this humorous picture intentionally to create positive affect. We want her to be looking at my emails with positive affect and a feeling of optimism. So for her, getting a clear picture, I want to be an art teacher. And then I had a conversation with her just very recently. Now I think 9 or 10 months without a lapse. She's abstaining completely. And we had a conversation about where she's having and going for further steps. And so I'll talk with you about, I'll show you a little illustration about that. So understanding barriers. I can't pull my life together with drinking. I don't recognize dangerous situations. I need an environment that supports longer term sobriety. So she chose the compensations. She puppy-proofed by staying away from her temptations. She had a number of trials of going into treatment programs and coming out and lapsing before she finally decided, you know what, maybe if I live with my parents for a while, I'll be able to learn this emotional regulation thing and I'll do better. And then, so while she was with her parents, we were able to work on resilience with her DBT skills. So now this is what her timeline looked like. It was a very fast engagement because she came to us with awareness of her problems, but there was about 6 months of really engaging with her because she wasn't fully acknowledging and fully aware of her neurocognitive impairments. And we were doing a lot of teaching her about that and helping her to accept it. Once she decided that she needed supports and needed an inpatient program and then a longer term stay with her parents, she was in active treatment. And we are about a year and a half doing, we are about a year and a half with emotional, all right. I apologize. I need to let my dog out. Come on, go. Okay, so the important interventions here were support to attend addictions program. She had 3 admissions, DBT skills. We'll talk about some resources to find cognitively adapted DBT skills for folks. Inpatient programming, she lived with her parents. Those were environmental supports and visual reminders of goals. We worked with her goals to be an art teacher, volunteering, safe social opportunities. And she also had very productive intervention with neuropsychiatric medications that help with focus and attention and also emotional regulation. So when we talked about in our previous webinar supporting cognitive process and reducing cognitive load, we want to slow down, use routines, set clear goals and agendas, break down tasks, create reminders, and remove distractions. And so, and now in this world of COVID that we've got, I'm doing these sessions virtually. So I actually have a little time-lapse video of me doing something that I promised that I would do in the last session, which is showing or giving an example of how I use pen and paper between myself and a client to reduce the cognitive load in a session. So the content of the session that I'm illustrating here is that she really wants to teach, and she needs to get her heart history degree, and she was really feeling down on herself for having taken so long to get back to her schooling. But she's starting to think about the fact that when she was in school before, that things were kind of a mess, but she realizes now I still need better work habits and I may need to compensate for my cognitive impairment. So this is time lapse, so it goes a little quick, but this is what it looked like. So she's telling me about the art teacher, and then we talk about, okay, so here's the things you need to do. These are the life skills. And then in the end, we start setting an agenda for goals that we might want to work on. And we decide whether each of these is really important. And then we start the process of prioritizing. So it's really as simple as that, having a piece of paper between you and the client, or in this COVID world, visible to the camera, and illustrating the conversation as you're having it to help the client keep track of what is happening in that discussion. So the magic of paper and pen, it slows down the conversation naturally. It provides a shared focus. It assists in processing the information. And at the end of the session, it acts as a memory aid. And now, instead of me sending her notes, she either uses my notes to make her own notes, or she takes her own notes during the session. When we are together in the same room, we are both contributing to that same piece of paper that's in front. So she's starting to share more responsibility for that cognitive compensation. And then it provides this opportunity for the joint planning. So here is a schematic that I take directly from the SUBI materials and our training, and this relates to all of the components that we use in the SUBI program. So right from the very beginning, looking at what's meaningful to the person and helping them to engage in that. Using behavioral intervention the way we discussed as a part of CRA. Actively considering cognitive compensation and skills training, very often DBT skills training. Using the principles of harm reduction and motivational interviewing, and cognitive behavior therapies, including relapse prevention. Now, this is the schematic that actually we give to clients that sort of approximates that phased approach to treatment. And we're very overt about telling them, you know, the first part of what we're going to do is learn how to work together. What is this program? What are your rights and responsibilities? And then the next step is really to envision the future. What do you want to do? What do you want from your life? And then helping the client to get as much as they can right then and there, prior to their even stopping the substance use. We talk about preparing for change, gathering the resources, taking action, and then maintaining the skills. And when we're training folks in as case managers, we're talking about the central roles. So in each phase, the role shifts a bit. Initially, all of the focus is put on building an alliance. In the next phase, it's on enhancing motivation for change and building optimism in that process. The preparation includes building a schedule of competing activity, building social networks, and then helping the client to figure out what really achievable goals are. And then there's action and skill building and relapse prevention. So I have only a few minutes left really to talk with you about this, but I'm going to kind of go through some resources that are available to you. This is a client workbook that we developed as a part of the SUBI program. It's not intended as a treatment program, but only to illustrate how common interventions can be made more accessible to people who have neurocognitive impairment. And it's a place to get started for ABI professionals. I gave you the link for downloading it. We talk about the use of peer support programs, for example, and how there's some special pitfalls for people who have poor memory, but they might actually be triggered by the sessions. And if they are triggered, but they don't remember the content of the session, then the session may become a trigger to use as opposed to helpful. So how to judiciously select or support programs for your clients. And there's information in there about things such as, when memory is very poor, avoid peer support, when empathy or social skills are a challenge, or if folks are disruptive and they can't relate to others and the stories that they tell them, it's probably not a good idea to be using AA or Smart Recovery or other self-help groups. And then another example would be ways of explaining the 12 steps to people and integrating neurobehavioral impairments into AA. So each of the workbook pages has a clearly stated goal, and it supports discussion from the client by eliciting from the client. Now, a lot of times eliciting from a client can be difficult because they may have trouble formulating sentences, they may have difficulty remembering. So giving them some statements to react to and reflect on is one way of helping to elicit more information. And so you'll see these self-assessments as a way of helping to get to elicit. And then each of the sections actually has a cue to both the client and the provider to make a note of what happened and to have a way of remembering what occurred. So these slides, the next couple of slides, and I won't speak to them directly, but they're there for you, are a summary of some of the general adaptations that we talked about for cognitive impairment and impairments of awareness and impaired reward system. And we also talked a little bit about, we haven't actually gotten a chance to talk about limited decision-making capacity and the fact that family is often in a supervisory role when people have had moderate to severe brain injuries. But the CRAFT approach really does apply along with other family intervention models that are popular in brain injury circles. So if you're a brain injury provider, you may be familiar with the brain injury family intervention from Kreutzer et al. And then we also, for dense amnesia, use specific cognitive compensation strategies like errorless learning. In other words, avoiding topics that you don't want the client to be having more exposure to and focusing on those things specifically that you do want the client to have more focus with. So some things to remember with each of your clients: everyone's going to have a unique combination of difficulties, and that a problem that you observe may have several different causes and require several different strategies. And that many of the strategies are the same strategies will be helpful for different problems. Again, here's a repeat of those recommended practices that we discussed and some key factors in accommodating cognitive impairments. So we only have just a few minutes to talk about question and answers. I hope that I've addressed most of what came forward. Folks were wondering, how do we tell apart substance use from other types of neurocognitive impairments, and how can you tell what's mental health and what's brain injury? And the answer is you really sort of can't. And I hope that we make clear how you can work with both of those kinds of difficulties together. One question that came up: well, what are the rates of TBI in the criminal justice system? And it depends on how you measure it and where you look, but there's indication that well over a half to 2/3 of folks have some history of acquired brain injury, and that as many as a third of the people who have acquired brain injury have severe brain injuries. And I know that many of my clients have had contact with the criminal justice system. And we are working on materials that directly address brain injury in the criminal justice system. Are there long-term programs in the country to help provide treatment in this area, and how effective are the outcomes for this treatment? Yes, there are some long-term treatment programs that deal very effectively with these. I'm a little leery of providing recommendations for specific programs, but I know that there's across the country, most of the long-term programs that deal with acquired brain injury are accustomed to having individuals who have substance use disorders. And so directly questioning them about their experience with those matters would be important. And there is some indication in the literature that those longer-term programs do yield good outcomes. This is a very difficult question, and how to manage clients with medical marijuana cards from sharing with peers. And what we have done, what we've talked about, is that medical, whether a medication is cannabis or opioids or antidepressants, sharing the medication is not a good idea. And the only situation that we have control over really are the policies that we have related to our own support services. So we do whatever we can to make it clear that our policy is that if an individual is sharing their substances with other clients, that they're creating a risk within our program, and that we need to take measures to ensure that they are not increasing the risks of other clients. And so sometimes this will result in, say, a compassionate expulsion from a program. We don't stop seeing that client, but we may insist that they have supervision in settings where they're going to be in contact with other clients, and to leave the program immediately upon finishing that supervised interaction. Now, it doesn't stop it, it doesn't minimize it, but it kind of sets a clear precedent that you don't want to be harming other folks, and the rules of our program are that that shouldn't happen. How do you tease apart the symptoms of substance abuse versus the impact of brain injury symptoms? And I think I've already sort of addressed that, which is that that's a very thorny issue, and you really can't. You really can't. Now, at the end of your handout here, you'll see some resources that I think are particularly helpful. Here's one that I haven't really talked about before, supporting clients to reduce impulsivity and emotional dysregulation. And that actually has a lot to do with this was one of the questions that came forward. This is particularly useful because it's adapted to folks who have cognitive impairment. It's developed by Julie Brown based on the dialectical behavior therapy that we are all familiar with, and there's the URL for it. Neuropsychiatric referral is another really important step if it's available, and also the use of environmental supports. Some of the other resources that we have are, if you're not familiar with some of the interventions, there's lots of information about both substances of abuse and the interventions on this website, www.drugabuse.gov. This is a particularly helpful white paper on cannabis that talks about the cognitive impact of cannabis, and I've read through it with clients to talk about harm reduction related to cannabis use after brain injury. And if you want to know more about CRAFT and CRA, here's the URLs to get actually treatment protocols and some of the outcome research. And related to substance use and TBI particularly, the Ohio Valley website, we've already talked about, has a number of fantastic resources. Brainline.org has a special section that's related to substance use and brain injury. And I know that they have loads of information there, including a link to the SUBI workbook. The workbook download is also available at our website, www.subi.ca. And there's a prevention video that reviews the prevention messages that's useful for watching with clients, and I would suggest that you have a look at it. And that's available at that URL there.
Hi, Carolyn. This is Amanda. Thank you so much for running this webinar today. You covered an incredible amount of information. I just wanted to break in because I think Zoom is kind of at the end of our particular time limit. Will people be able to reach out to you if they have any questions following this?
Absolutely. And we are launching in November, actually. We thought it was going to be October, but it will be November. A course that goes into some of this information more in greater detail. And if you want more information about that course, you can go to teach@camh.ca. It may either be free or on a cost recovery basis. So it won't be too expensive, but we're not certain exactly what the fee will be yet. But that's in the works.
Well, fantastic. That'll be a wonderful resource for folks. Well, you all, thank you so much for joining us. We will have a brief survey following this sent out to you, and we do appreciate your time, Carolyn. Thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and hit pause on the recording.